I think the main thing is that after 4 years of there being only one thing you can talk about in this country, which is Donald Trump, it's been hard to decide which of the many other challenges facing the country to address first. But I think it's clear that what President Joe Biden needs to address first is the coronavirus pandemic itself. President Trump so thoroughly failed even to acknowledge the problem that last night, less than 24 hours before he left office and after the country passed the 400,000 death threshold, was the first national tribute to those who have died from the disease, and it was left to the incoming president-elect to do that. In fairness, the Trump administration deserves some credit for the Warp Speed program to accelerate development of a COVID vaccine by guaranteeing government purchase. Maybe perhaps the only time in the last 4 years that the federal administration acknowledged that perhaps we need a government. The new administration's chief task will be to set up vaccine distribution and contact tracing regimes, which means basically a functioning government. Doing this is something the executive branch essentially can and must do itself, which is important because despite the sentiments of harmony in Washington that we see today, the new president's ability to get much out of Congress is seriously in doubt, unfortunately. For instance, the pandemic requires not just a health response, but also an economic response, as Marta noted. Throughout the year, most Republicans have strenuously resisted substantial financial aid for average Americans suffering in the pandemic-induced downturn. While there is enough support now to enact additional aid, Republicans remain opposed to the incoming administration's more grandiose spending plans to combat the pandemic and economic slowdown. The politics of the Republican Party will be very difficult in this regard. There are 11 GOP senators who voted not to accept the election returns. There are a half dozen GOP senators who plan to run for president in 2024. And then there's Mitch McConnell, the GOP Senate leader, who famously told his colleagues at the beginning of the Obama administration that their success depended upon blocking everything the president attempted in order to make him a one-termer. It's doubtful that McConnell's view has changed appreciably in that regard. Put all that together and it provides little room for picking up needed bipartisan support. Much of what Biden can and must do, therefore, will consist of unilateral executive action, and we'll see a lot of this starting today. Trump did much of his damage through executive orders since he proved incapable of working with others, and some of Biden's most significant work will be simply to undo them. He's planning to do much of that today, starting, for example, with undoing Trump's Muslim travel ban, re-entering the Paris Climate Accords, and moving the country back to a more welcoming stance on immigration. But the Biden team has also signaled that it will cease construction of Trump's signature border wall, although the Homeland Security Secretary designate Alejandro Mayorkas has declined to commit as to whether the new administration will start taking it down. So what as a strategic matter can President Biden do about all this? I'd suggest he can basically pick up where President Obama left off, not 4 years ago, but 12 years ago. Obama took office at the depth of the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. His chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, famously remarked that one should not let a crisis go to waste, meaning that the administration would think big and use the crisis to address fundamental long-term challenges facing the country, specifically to build a new energy, transportation, and information infrastructure for the 21st century. But that administration made four main mistakes, in my view. It left the stimulus details to Congress, resulting in a program more about individual pork barrel projects and a coherent economic rebuilding effort. It focused on short-term gains, specifically funded projects had to be shovel-ready, quote unquote, rather than a long-term vision. President Obama ultimately opted for total stimulus spending large enough to engender a conservative counterattack, but not large enough fully to stimulate the economy. And the administration soon pivoted from an economic focus to the battle over what eventually became Obamacare. In many ways, President Biden is in a stronger position to tackle these same challenges today, and 12 years later, they are even more critical. The U.S. must make the change from a carbon to a digital economy if it is to maintain both its standard of living and its global leadership in the decades ahead. This will require investments and changes in how we invest in both physical and human capital. The Biden administration has a leisure of keeping a long-term focus on this transition as part of a coherent strategy for the country's future, and to do so with unprecedented levels of spending. I'm normally a fiscal conservative, but with interest rates at historic lows, now is the time to spend for America's future. And perhaps most importantly, a coherent program to rebuild the nation's infrastructure and manufacturing capacity, but in service of a new economy, would provide some of the economic relief that the battered parts of the country, the parts that overwhelmingly supported President Trump and feel alienated today, badly need. And there is politics in this, as in everything. Republicans will oppose such spending measures. This gives Biden and the Democrats the chance to position themselves, rather than the Trumpist party, as speaking for the needs of this disaffected portion of the country. But to do this, they will need to avoid the one major mistake I think they're poised to make, immediately to raise taxes significantly to pay for all this. That would be the fiscally prudent thing to do. It would be a political mistake on which any aggressive economic recovery effort would likely founder.